Across the silent ruins of Earth's deepest past, long before the first dinosaur stirred the soil, there existed a world the planet itself has forgotten. Continents were arranged in forms no map could capture. Oceans stretched across latitudes that no longer exist. Entire ecosystems thrived under skies thick with volcanic haze or glowing with ancient sunlight filtered through unfamiliar atmospheres. Yet from these colossal epochs, stretching hundreds of millions of years, almost nothing survives. Only fragments, only whispers, only the faintest geological pulses of what might once have been. And if Earth can erase ages of life so thoroughly that even their memory collapses, what does that say about our ability to preserve anything at all? How can we expect certainty when the world we inhabit erases its own stories with geological precision? This is where our inquiry begins, in the tension between the enormity of time and the fragility of truth, not with conspiracies or denial, but with a deeper question. What does it mean to believe something absolutely on a planet that retains almost nothing of its past? The moon landing stands as one of humanity's most documented achievements, supported by layers of scientific evidence. Yet when framed against the void of Earth's erased civilizations, it becomes more than a historical event. It becomes a philosophical mirror. Some claim it is impossible to believe humans survived the journey to the moon. Their argument does not withstand scientific scrutiny. The physics of transit, the shielding against radiation, the engineering solutions developed by NASA, all of these are well established. The impossibility emerges not from the event itself, but from the expectation that proof should carry a permanence Earth has never preserved. Certainty requires memory. Memory requires continuity. And continuity is something Earth does not promise. Picture a Devonian shoreline 400 million years ago, where armored fishes glide beneath shallow waters. Imagine a carboniferous forest towering like a cathedral of green, its canopy lost in humid clouds. These landscapes existed for periods longer than all of human civilization combined, yet their record is broken, scattered, incomplete. If intelligence rose in those eras, if civilizations built structures or shaped their environments, Earth would have swallowed every trace. Not because they lacked significance, but because no planet designed for life is designed to preserve truth. This is the paradox at the heart of our journey. The moon landing is real, the evidence is vast. But in a universe where meaning dissolves, even perfect evidence cannot guarantee eternal clarity. Just as prehistoric civilizations before the dinosaurs, real or hypothetical, are now indecipherable, our own achievements could become enigmas to future worlds. Tonight, we descend into a narrative built not on denial, but on philosophical skepticism. A skepticism rooted in the understanding that time is not simply long, it is merciless. And in that mercilessness, the concept of definitive proof becomes fragile. This documentary explores the impossibility not of going to the moon, but of preserving the certainty of that journey forever. We examine how Earth's geologic silence shapes reinterpretation, how ancient epochs hint at forgotten patterns of rise and collapse, and how the moon itself becomes a symbol of preservation without understanding. Through these lenses, we uncover a deeper story. That human truth, no matter how luminous, stands on foundations that time will eventually reclaim. And so we begin, across forgotten continents, through erased worlds, toward a question that lingers beyond science or doubt. Can we ever claim absolute certainty when the planet beneath us cannot remember its own beginning? The camera descends toward a landscape older than memory. Not the fossil-rich beds of the Mesozoic, familiar from documentaries and textbooks, but the nearly unreachable silence of the Paleozoic and Precambrian. Here, continents swirled beneath volcanic skies, and oceans teemed with life utterly alien to the forms that later dominated Earth. Yet these vast realms, stretching across spans of time far greater than the age of dinosaurs, exist today as scattered fragments of stone. Most of their stories have been erased, overwritten, or transformed beyond recognition. This is the first truth we must confront. Earth is not designed to preserve certainty. It is designed to renew itself. The camera glides across the ancient supercontinent Gondwana, drifting through vast swamps of the Carboniferous, where towering lacophytes thrust upward like living monoliths. Their reign lasted for millions of years. Their ecosystems shaped the atmosphere. Their collapse forged the coal seams buried deep beneath our modern cities. Yet for all their immensity, their memory survives only in compressed carbon and occasional impressions in shale. Their world was real, thriving, dominant. But Earth did not preserve their story. It preserved only the consequences. Now the scene transitions to the Devonian, the age of fishes. Rivers meander through landscapes untouched by vertebrate footprints. Armored placoderms glide through shallow seas, their jaws snapping with mechanical precision. Coral metropolises stretch across continental shelves. But these too became victims of Earth's geologic churn. The continents shifted, the seas drained or deepened. Sediments buried or crushed everything that once lived. What remains of these worlds is only enough to hint at their existence, never enough to reconstruct their truth. This is the planet on which humans attempt to build certainty. A world that culls its own memories. A world that destroys its archives. A world that offers the illusion of permanence but functions as an engine of erasure. The narration slows, allowing the implications to settle. If Earth can erase entire ecosystems spanning tens of millions of years, what chance does any single event, from ancient times or modern, have of retaining clarity across deep time? This question is not about the moon landing. It is about the fragility of human knowledge in a universe shaped by transformation. Prehistoric civilizations before the dinosaurs, if they existed, would have faced a fate far harsher than human imagination allows. Even monumental structures crafted with sophisticated technology would not survive hundreds of millions of years. Stone would fracture under tectonic pressure. Metal would oxidize into nothing. Ceramics would shatter. Organic materials would dissolve. No message, no architecture, no tool could endure the cycles of metamorphism and subduction. The planet itself is the adversary of permanence. This reflection leads to a broader realization. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of Earth. And this is where reinterpretative skepticism gains its footing. When individuals question the permanence of proof, whether about prehistory or the moon landing, they are unknowingly confronting a deeper philosophical tension. The idea that truth itself is not stable in a world where memory is an accident rather than a design. The camera moves into a cross-section of continental crust where ancient rocks fold into one another like pages melted together in a forgotten book. Metamorphic bands shimmer, once sediments transformed into crystalline patterns that reveal nothing about their origins. Within this chaotic beauty lies a silent warning. Even the most concrete evidence, if subjected to enough time, becomes meaningless. This geological truth forms the backbone of reinterpretative theories about the moon. Not that the event lacked evidence, not that humans did not go, but that the idea of definitive proof, eternal, unbreakable, context-free, is incompatible with the nature of the planet that nurtured us. Proof is temporary, interpretation is fragile, and meaning is the first casualty of time. As the narration deepens, the camera pulls back to reveal Earth as a whole, vibrant, evolving, restless. A world that forgets. A world that reinvents. A world that ensures no age, no species, no achievement remains fully preserved. This view becomes a bridge into the next chapter, where fossil gaps and unexplained silences challenge our assumptions about what can be known. How can we assert absolute certainty about the moon landing or any event when Earth itself destroys the continuity upon which certainty is built? The camera sweeps across an exposed cliff face, where layers of sedimentary stone rest like the pages of an ancient book, most of its chapters missing, others torn, fused, or rewritten by the unrelenting machinery of deep time. Within these gaps lie the greatest mysteries of Earth's past, not because they contain hidden evidence waiting to be uncovered, but because they offer nothing at all. Silence, absence. A reminder that the geologic record is not a library but a ruin, assembled from scattered fragments. This silence is where reinterpretative theories take root, not out of defiance but out of recognition of a profound truth. When enormous swaths of Earth's history have been rendered undecipherable, how can humanity claim certainty about anything extending across cosmic distances or technological complexity? The moon landing is not the subject of doubt, but it becomes a symbolic lens, forcing us to reflect on the constraints of memory, continuity, and context. The narrative carries us into the Cambrian period, more than 500 million years ago, when life abruptly diversified in one of the most dramatic evolutionary bursts known to science. Trilobites scuttled across sea floors. Strange organisms floated through the water column. Predators with grasping appendages and optical precision roamed primordial reefs. Yet what preceded this explosion remains a mystery. Fossils appear suddenly, fully formed, as though emerging from an earlier chapter that Earth discarded without explanation. The camera glides across these earlier sediments, almost barren, etched with faint microbial films and enigmatic depressions. If a civilization existed before the Cambrian, the evidence would be gone. If intelligence flourished for millions of years before oxygen stabilized the atmosphere, its traces would have been consumed by metamorphism or lost to subduction. The planet's crust recycles itself, swallowing stories before they can be told. This is not an argument for forgotten civilizations. It is an argument for humility, a demonstration that even the most dramatic events in Earth's prehistory can be reduced to absence. Absence not because they never occurred, but because the mechanisms of preservation failed. The camera shifts to the Ordovician, where life thrived in ways scarcely imaginable to us. Coral gardens expanded across shallow seas, and a proliferation of marine organisms reshaped ecosystems at colossal scales. Yet when the Ordovician mass extinction struck, the strata record the event only through hints, thin layers of unusual isotopes, sudden disappearances in fossil sequences, ambiguous mineral signatures. Entire biomes vanished, leaving only cryptic shadows. Even extinction, one of the most catastrophic processes in Earth's history, struggles to leave clear evidence. This fragility of record complicates every attempt to reconstruct the deep past. Fossils are rare not because life was rare, but because preservation is accidental. Geological conditions must align perfectly for a moment of life to crystallize into stone. Most organisms, most events, most eras fade into oblivion. In this context, when individuals assert that certain aspects of the moon mission seem impossible, they are unconsciously grappling with the limitations imposed by Earth's own amnesia. The question is not whether humans survived the trip. They did. The science is clear. But the expectation of definitive, everlasting proof is incompatible with the reality that Earth preserves almost nothing with permanence. If entire oceans of life, entire ages of complexity, entire ecosystems spanning millions of years can vanish without narrative clarity, how can we imagine that any modern event, no matter how extraordinary, can transcend the fragility of evidence? The camera dives into the rock layers again, this time revealing an unconformity, a sharp boundary where millions of years are missing. Erosion swept them away. Tectonics folded them into deeper strata. Volcanic forces erased their codes. These voids are not anomalies. They are the rule. Earth's history is discontinuous by nature. This discontinuity fuels reinterpretation. When one sees gaps too large to explain, absences too profound to justify, it becomes natural to question the survival of information. When someone claims humans could not have endured the moon's radiation belts, they are often responding less to the scientific data and more to the intuition that the universe is too harsh, too vast, too disordered for certainty to endure. The moon landing becomes an intellectual paradox not because it lacked feasibility, but because it stands as an event whose permanence relies on continuity, a continuity Earth has never upheld. It is not the science that is doubted. It is the assumption that any human achievement can resist the erosive force of time. As the camera pulls back, revealing the Earth rotating through light and shadow, the silence of fossil gaps becomes a metaphor, a reminder that what we know is built upon what survives, and what survives is only a fraction of what once was. The next chapter follows this trail deeper, into the moon itself, a world that preserves everything, yet explains nothing. The camera rises from Earth's fractured strata and crosses the gulf of space, gliding toward a world that could not be more different. A world without erosion, without rain, without tectonics. A world that has no atmosphere to weather its surface, no oceans to grind its history into sediment, no mantle circulation to recycle its crust into the abyss. The moon is stillness embodied, a silent guardian of everything placed upon it. If Earth is the destroyer of memory, the moon is its archivist. Yet this contrast reveals a paradox far stranger than the void itself. As the camera settles across the lunar regolith, the simplicity of its surface becomes unsettling. Every footprint, every tool, every disturbance remains exactly where it was left. Lunar dust reacts to astronaut movement with a dry, powdery precision that locks impressions into permanence. A single step can survive longer than all of recorded human history combined. But permanence here is deceptive. The moon preserves shapes. It does not preserve meaning. We drift across a field of craters frozen in time. One crater may be 1 billion years old, another might be a fraction of that. Their rims eroded only by the slow rain of micrometeorites. Nothing is rewritten, nothing is hidden, but nothing is explained. The moon records without interpretation. The scene moves to the Apollo landing sites. Metallic structures gleam faintly under harsh sunlight. Tracks weave patterns across the dust, leading to instruments left long ago. These artifacts are undeniably real. Their presence is undeniable. But the camera now shifts the frame, inviting the viewer to consider a thought experiment. Imagine an intelligence arriving on the moon millions of years from now, long after humanity has ceased to exist. No human archives survive. No digital records remain. No cultural memory has endured. What would this intelligence conclude? They would see an abandoned descent stage, unusual in geometry. They would find reflective panels and scientific instruments, all intact but silent. They might detect the chemical signatures of human activity embedded in dust. But without context, without the chain of interpretation, the meaning of these artifacts dissolves. The event they represent becomes unanchored. The story becomes speculative. The proof becomes ambiguous. The moon, the perfect preserver of form, cannot preserve the logic that gave form its purpose. This tension mirrors the mystery of prehistoric worlds before the dinosaurs. Even if civilizations existed in those primordial ages, even if intelligence shaped landscapes in ways we cannot comprehend, Earth would have destroyed their context entirely. A carved stone becomes a grain of quartz, a monument becomes a metamorphic band, a city becomes a mineralogical curiosity with no story attached. The structure may endure, but the narrative is gone. Herein lies the philosophical connection. Earth's forgotten civilizations demonstrate how artifacts lose meaning without explanation. The moon demonstrates how artifacts retain form without explanation. Both worlds expose the same conceptual fragility. Proof, in the eternal sense, is impossible. The narration deepens as the camera shifts between Earth's turbulent crust and the moon's unchanging surface. This duality becomes a metaphor for human understanding itself. Earth represents flux, uncertainty, the collapsing of stories. The moon represents stasis without meaning. Together, they show that truth is not preserved by physical evidence alone. Truth depends on interpretation, continuity, and memory. When individuals claim humans could not have survived the journey to the moon, their skepticism often arises not from ignorance, but from an intuitive awareness of this fragility. They confront the idea that something as extraordinary as traveling beyond Earth's cradle should leave behind proof that transcends time. But nothing transcends time. Not fossils, not empires, not civilizations, and not even the clearest documentation. The moon landing becomes the ultimate narrative paradox. Scientifically solid, historically documented, yet philosophically vulnerable to the same limitations that erode all human knowledge. The chapter closes with the camera drifting upward, placing Earth and moon side by side. Earth shimmering with change, the moon suspended in permanent stillness. Two worlds that together illustrate the impossible nature of eternal proof. Earth destroys meaning. The moon preserves without meaning. And between them hangs humanity, seeking certainty in a universe that offers none. The moon preserves, Earth erases. Yet even preservation is incomplete without understanding. The camera glides across the lunar surface, lingering on a single astronaut footprint, sharply defined in dust untouched for decades. It is perfect evidence of a presence, yet evidence alone cannot convey purpose. Without context, without narrative, even the clearest trace becomes open to speculation. This is the fragile boundary between fact and meaning, the space where reinterpretation thrives. Consider Earth's own history. Fossils provide undeniable proof of life, yet their interpretation is subject to shifting scientific paradigms. Trilobites reveal morphology, but their behaviors, ecosystems, and the full scope of their existence remain largely conjectural. Geological layers record volcanic eruptions, extinctions, and climate shifts, but they cannot directly explain intention, culture, or knowledge. Meaning requires more than observation. It demands a framework to connect evidence into story. On a planet that often obliterates continuity, that framework is never guaranteed. On the moon, artifacts are preserved in stasis, yet they suffer a parallel vulnerability. The descent stages, experimental tools, and footprints remain, but absent cultural memory, future observers could misinterpret them entirely. The difference between humans today and a hypothetical post-human civilization is one of narrative context. Without context, even absolute material evidence can become a puzzle devoid of explanation. A scientific instrument may be intact, but its purpose, its significance, its relationship to the broader Apollo mission becomes speculative. The artifact survives, understanding does not. This is where skepticism toward the moon landing enters a philosophical domain. It is not skepticism of physics, engineering, or historical documentation. It is a recognition that evidence without interpretation is fragile, that permanence is an illusion, and that the certainty humans place upon their achievements is always provisional. In other words, the impossibility some perceive does not stem from the act of traveling to the moon, but from the expectation that such acts can resist the erosion of meaning over time. Earth's prehistoric civilizations before the dinosaurs provide a cautionary parallel. If intelligence once existed in these erased epochs, their traces are beyond recovery. Structures, artifacts, even bioengineered landscapes would be gone. The planet's own processes, tectonics, erosion, subduction, ensure that interpretation is impossible. This realization reframes our relationship with evidence. It is never enough to see. We must understand, contextualize, and preserve interpretation alongside materiality. Without these, proof loses its authority. The camera moves to cross-sections of the moon's regolith, where human footprints overlay ancient craters, juxtaposing permanence and fragility. Here, the narrative underscores the philosophical tension. Humanity's greatest achievements may endure physically, yet their meanings are contingent upon memory, continuity, and comprehension. Proof is relational. It exists only when the observer can interpret, connect, and contextualize. This insight illuminates the psychological origins of claims that the moon landing is impossible. Observers sense, on an instinctual level, that permanence is rare. They see a world, Earth, that routinely erases its own history. They extrapolate, consciously or unconsciously, to the moon, projecting uncertainty where physics offers none. Their skepticism, therefore, is not necessarily a rejection of fact. It is a reflection on the nature of evidence itself, on the human expectation of certainty in a universe defined by loss and decay. In this space, the documentary invites reflection. It bridges geology, history, and philosophy, connecting the obliterated traces of pre-dinosaur worlds with the preserved yet contextless artifacts on the moon. Through this lens, proof becomes an ephemeral concept, dependent less on what exists and more on the frameworks we construct to make sense of it. Here, the narrative introduces a subtle, meditative call to action. Like and subscribe to, continue exploring these intersections of memory, evidence, and forgotten civilizations. The journey is not just about the moon. It is about understanding the fragile scaffolding of human knowledge itself, suspended between permanence and oblivion. The scene opens on a silent Earth, seen from far above, wrapped in shimmering bands of invisible force. These are the Van Allen radiation belts, regions of charged particles trapped by our planet's magnetic field. They pulse like ancient guardians, relics of a cosmic architecture far older than any species that has walked the continents below. In this chapter, the narration focuses not on debating scientific consensus, but on exploring why these belts have become a symbolic threshold for those who claim the moon landing would have been impossible to survive. The perspective is philosophical, interpretative, and rooted in the documentary lens of forgotten epochs and unanswerable questions. The camera drifts downward, passing through layers of time in Earth's crust. Fossilized corals, petrified forests, the faintest impressions of microbial mats that once thrived before the Cambrian bloom. All of them speak to what was once here, and what is now lost. This is the thematic bridge. Earth erases while space preserves. Yet even preservation is not immunity from reinterpretation. The narration continues. The Van Allen belts are real, measurable, thoroughly studied. Engineers and physicists have spent decades understanding them, modeling safe trajectories and calculating the exposure astronauts would face. Yet for some, these belts represent more than radiation. They symbolize the boundary between the known and the unknowable, a modern mythic barrier akin to the ancient river Styx, separating the world of certainty from the domain of speculation. Why does this boundary fascinate the skeptic mind? Because thresholds always do. Throughout human history, crossing a boundary, be it a mountain range, an ocean horizon, or a celestial frontier, has forced cultures to reimagine their place in the universe. And when the boundary is crossed faster than collective imagination can adapt, mystery fills the gap. The documentary leans into this psychological tension. Those who view the moon landing with suspicion often cite the Van Allen belts not out of strict scientific critique, but out of symbolic intuition. The belts embody danger, cosmic hostility, and the unknown. They feel like a point beyond which humans should not pass. The idea that fragile beings survive the crossing challenges deeply seated narratives about human vulnerability and cosmic scale. Here the narration pauses, letting the viewer sit with an unsettling thought. If humanity struggles to interpret its own prehistoric past, epochs so ancient they precede even the earliest dinosaurs, how can it fully internalize the idea of crossing into space, into a realm where Earth's protective magnetic shield no longer applies? The camera returns to Earth's surface. Deep-time geology reveals supercontinents that rose and shattered, oceans that formed and vanished, entire species that emerged, flourished, and disappeared without leaving a trace. The narrator's voice becomes low, contemplative. Our planet has hosted worlds before ours. Civilizations, if they ever existed in those forgotten ages, would have been erased by the same tectonic and chemical forces that reduce mountains to sand. Nothing survives unaltered forever. Not continents, not oceans, not memory. Given such fragility, some claim that proof of the moon landing is equally vulnerable, not in its historical authenticity, but in its perceived permanence. They fear that one day, interpretation of this achievement will fracture, fragment, and drift like continental plates. Thus the Van Allen belts become more than radiation zones. They become a metaphor for epistemic thresholds. A reminder that when humanity crosses new frontiers, certainty can never fully keep pace. The documentary closes this chapter with a transitional hook. The camera zooms outward, past the belts themselves, into the blackness beyond. What other boundaries has humanity crossed without fully grasping the implications? What other frontiers, scientific or historical, remain shadows shaped by incomplete memory? And if meaning is as fragile as any fossil washed away by eons, what then becomes of truth? The screen opens on a desolate plain of the ancient Earth. Not the Earth we know, the Earth of shifting dunes, crushing pressures, and volcanic breaths older than vertebrates. A world untouched by dinosaurs, dominated by continents that no longer exist, and skies colored by minerals long dissolved. It is a landscape without witnesses, without continuity, without narrative. Here, the documentary returns to its central lens. The idea that skepticism toward the moon landing often arises not from physics, but from the physics of memory itself. It is not the spacecraft that seems fragile, it is our collective confidence in interpreting events that exist beyond our direct experience. The narrator begins with a slow, grounded cadence. Humans trust what they can reconstruct, but deep time teaches that reconstruction is always incomplete. Fossils are fragments. Stratigraphy is a palimpsest. Geological records are echoes of events we can no longer witness. In the same way, historical events, no matter how well documented, are susceptible to reinterpretation, reframing, and mythologizing. Even the moon landing, one of humanity's most meticulously recorded achievements, becomes vulnerable to a phenomenon far more complex than doubt: epistemic erosion. Images shift to the Apollo capsules floating through the void. Telemetry streams cascade across the screen. Mission logs, astronaut testimonies, archival footage. All of it is evidence. All of it is interpretation. The documentary emphasizes the moon landing occurred, and yet the meaning of the moon landing exists within a cultural ecosystem that constantly mutates. The paradox lies not in physics, but in perception. For some, the distance between Earth and the moon is less intimidating than the distance between evidence and belief. Why? Because belief is anchored not in data, but in narrative continuity. And continuity is something Earth itself refuses to provide. The scene transitions to sweeping aerial shots of eroded mountain ranges, once towering, now scarred and diminished, once continents, now ocean floors. If we struggle to preserve the story of our own planet across millions of years, how can we expect a single generation-spanning narrative, like the journey to the moon, to remain immune to reinterpretation? The fragility of human memory creates conditions in which extraordinary events become vulnerable to philosophical doubt, even when the evidence is abundant. The documentary explores this tension through the lens of prehistoric civilizations that may have risen and fallen before the age of dinosaurs. Whether hypothetical, speculative, or symbolic, their absence demonstrates a fundamental reality. Earth does not preserve its stories. Earth preserves only their ruins. And sometimes not even that. This becomes a mirror for how some interpret the moon landing. The farther an event moves from the present, the easier it becomes to fragment its meaning. The photographs, the rock samples, the independent tracking data, these remain. But the cultural memory that surrounds them is fluid, changing, vulnerable. The narration slows, sinking deeper into the philosophical dimension. The impossibility some see in the moon landing is not an impossibility of science. It is an impossibility of certainty. A recognition that human beings often seek absolute proof in a universe where absolutes do not endure. The chapter deepens the connection to deep time. If civilizations existed before the dinosaurs, civilizations erased by tectonics, melted by magma, ground into dust, then the absence of their traces teaches us something profound. Evidence alone is never enough. It must be preserved, interpreted, and continuously reaffirmed across generations. When continuity breaks, history becomes myth, and myth becomes an invitation to doubt. That doubt extends outward, from the fossil record to the moon itself. Not because the moon landing lacks evidence, but because humans instinctively recognize how easily that evidence could one day become contextless, inert, or lost. The camera moves back to the stark contrast between Earth's erosive chaos and the moon's silent permanence. What survives? What fades? What becomes impossible to believe simply because memory cannot hold it? A brief, unobtrusive CTA emerges like a whisper carried by geologic wind. Like and subscribe to continue this journey into forgotten epochs, fractured truths, and the fragile architecture of human understanding. The chapter concludes with a narrative hook, pulling the viewer forward. If survival of meaning is so uncertain on Earth, then what does it reveal about the truths we project onto the cosmos? And what other paradoxes await when we confront the boundary between belief and the void? The chapter opens with a vision of primordial Earth, long before the first dinosaurs. Thunderheads tower over a landscape of volcanic plains, lightning illuminating continents still forming. Strange microbial reefs glow faintly in shallow seas. Beneath the crust, tectonic plates grind and fold, rewriting the planet with a violence no civilization could ever survive. Here, the narration shifts to a contemplative tone, anchoring the audience in a disquieting question. What if humanity is not the first species to contemplate the sky? What if others once looked upward and wondered whether it was possible to cross the void? This is not a claim. It is an invitation to consider memory beyond evidence, possibility beyond preservation, and history beyond what Earth allows us to recover. The camera travels upward, beyond the storms, piercing the upper atmosphere. The narrator guides the viewer toward a connection that blends cosmology, archaeology, and skepticism about the moon mission into a single philosophical thread. If Earth once hosted civilizations erased by deep time, their absence demonstrates that even extraordinary feats can vanish without leaving discernible traces. The implication is not that the moon landing did not occur, but that all events, no matter how monumental, depend on fragile chains of interpretation to be believed. And this fragility is the hidden psychological engine fueling claims of impossibility. The narrative continues. Humans live within a fragile envelope of memory, individual, cultural, and geological. The moon, by contrast, is static, unchanging, stripped of erosion, weather, and tectonics. It is a natural museum of the cosmos. Yet even a perfect museum cannot guarantee understanding. A relic without a story becomes an enigma. A footprint without a context becomes a riddle. A landmark without a lineage becomes an artifact of unknown origin. Skeptics of the moon landing often frame their concerns through scientific language, radiation, trajectory, thermal regulation. But beneath the surface lies something far older. A fear woven into humanity's collective psyche since deep time. The fear that meaning does not survive. The narrative turns toward the idea of ancient skies. Before dinosaurs, before mammals, before forests, the skies were filled with cosmic debris. Impacts reshaped continents, boiled oceans, and reset ecosystems. If any advanced species existed in these lost ages, a speculative but narratively potent idea, they would have been forced to look up at a sky far more volatile than ours. Their myths, their sciences, their existential anchors would have been forged under a firmament that constantly threatened erasure. This deep time context reframes the skepticism around humanity's journey to the moon. To leave Earth is to defy the constant erasure written into the planet's geology. To return with evidence is to challenge the long-standing natural order in which stories vanish and civilizations forget. The narrator speaks with stillness. The question is not whether humans could travel to the moon. Physics allows it. Engineering achieved it. The deeper question is whether the meaning of such a feat can endure in a world where even mountains are temporary. How can absolute certainty survive when Earth itself refuses to preserve its own past? Images flash between ancient strata and Apollo spacecraft drifting through darkness. Layer upon layer. Epoch upon epoch. Memory struggling against oblivion. The viewer is invited into a reflective tension. Perhaps the moon landing feels impossible to some, not because it contradicts science, but because it contradicts the deeper rhythm of Earth's history, a history defined by disappearance, silence, and the loss of stories too old to reconstruct. In that sense, skepticism becomes not denial, but an echo of a planetary truth. Nothing on Earth, not even meaning, is guaranteed to endure. The chapter closes with a quiet hook, leading the viewer toward what comes next. If even the sky was once different, violent, shifting, unrecognizable, then what else about our understanding of both the cosmos and our own past remains incomplete? What other frontiers, like the journey to the moon, challenge the continuity of memory itself? The images open on a world submerged in deep time. Not the familiar Earth of fossilized dinosaurs or the Cambrian seas, but a far older, more alien sphere. The continents drift beneath a haze of volcanic gases, and the oceans churn with chemical storms. The camera sinks below the crust, into a realm rarely explored in speculative narratives. The deep lithospheric archives, the pressures and temperatures where the memory of epochs is crushed into crystalline oblivion. The narration enters with an authoritative calm, drawing a parallel between these hidden layers and the human need for certainty. If entire landscapes, mountains, continents, oceans, can vanish without leaving a trace, What confidence can we claim about any single event in history, no matter how recent or technologically recorded? The moon landing becomes a mirror held up to an inconvenient truth. Our species builds meaning atop foundations that Earth itself refuses to preserve. Yet, as the camera moves through fault zones and ancient cratons, a provocative hypothesis emerges. Not a claim of fact, but a narrative device meant to expand the horizon of inquiry. What if the deepest crust, under certain conditions, preserves architectural anomalies, patterns so geometric, so structured, that their presence cannot be explained through geology alone? Patterns that hint, faintly, at civilizations predating the dinosaurs, or even the earliest multicellular life. The narrator maintains a disciplined skepticism. These anomalies could be misinterpretations, natural processes masquerading as design. But their existence, hypothetical though they may be, serves a purpose within the overarching philosophical arc. To demonstrate that the line between erosion and memory, between artifact and coincidence, is thinner than we admit. This is where the video's thematic lens sharpens. Reinterpretative theories of historical events rely not on disproving what is known, but on exposing the fragility of the mechanisms by which we know them. Just as geologists question apparent regularities in rock formations, skeptics question the chain of documentation surrounding any monumental achievement, including the lunar mission. Not to dismantle truth, but to reveal its dependence on context, transmission, and interpretation. The imagery transitions to subterranean tunnels, lit by bioluminescent minerals. The camera glides past formations resembling spirals, chambers, and corridors, not claims of ancient construction, but visual metaphors for the unknowability of deep time. Each structure embodies the possibility that Earth's memory is warped, partial, inconsistent. As the narration expands, it ties these visions to the broader speculation about ancient civilizations. Before the age of reptiles, before forests rooted themselves into the soil, Earth may have hosted ecosystems operating on principles unfamiliar to us. Perhaps even intelligences adapted to climates and chemistries utterly unlike those of later eras. If so, any record of their existence would have been pulverized by plate tectonics, melted by mantle plumes, recycled into magma oceans. Their story would be gone, overwritten billions of years before our earliest ancestors stirred. From this vantage point, the moon becomes a symbol of perfect retention. Its surface is static, unchanging, a geological archive. Yet even there, interpretation reigns. A footprint is undeniable, but meaning is not. A photograph can confirm presence, yet still be doubted. This tension fuels the narrative. We seek certainty in the very place where certainty dissolves. The chapter advances toward its thematic crescendo. If subterranean Earth hides secrets older than life, then the difficulty of proving a lunar event becomes philosophical rather than empirical. The issue is not evidence, but the limits of human epistemology. We inherit stories, decode signals, trust instruments. But our understanding of the world, whether ancient Earth or contemporary spaceflight, remains vulnerable to the distortions of time, memory, and narrative framing. A brief transition follows, reinforcing suspense. As we ascend back toward the surface, the question deepens. If meaning is so fragile, what happens when we venture beyond Earth, into territories where memory has no geological container at all? What becomes of truth when it is forced to stand alone, suspended in the vacuum of space? Like and subscribe to join the next descent into deep time speculation. The scene opens in near silence. A slow drift across the lunar surface reveals a stark, shadowed landscape where time feels frozen. No atmosphere, no erosion, no wind to disturb a single grain of dust. In this vacuum, even the smallest imprint might remain for millions of years. The camera tracks a solitary ridge, then ascends into orbit, revealing Earth as a distant blue sphere suspended in the blackness. The narration begins with restrained authority, its tone contemplative. In the void between worlds, evidence behaves differently. A footprint may endure longer than a civilization. A discarded tool may outlast continents. Yet the meaning assigned to these traces remains deeply human, shaped by assumptions and worldviews that shift like sand under gravity's subtle pull. this is where the paradox intensifies. If the moon preserves, Earth erases. If the moon remembers, Earth forgets. And in this polarity lies the essence of the skeptical lens that fuels reinterpretative theories. The understanding that proof, even when recorded in the most durable of environments, does not escape the interpretative frameworks of those who examine it. The narrative pivots to ancient Earth, superimposing visuals of primordial oceans boiling beneath a toxic sky. The planet's crust is young, unstable, turbulent. In the backdrop of geological time, even the greatest terrestrial milestones become ephemeral. Civilizations, if any existed during epochs lost beneath the mantle, would have no surviving record, no ruins, no artifacts, nothing to anchor their memory except speculation and the rare, perplexing patterns found in rocks older than biology itself. This duality between Earth's selective amnesia and the moon's unyielding preservation forms a philosophical tension that underpins the chapter. If the moon holds onto every mark, why is the certainty of our presence there still contested? If Earth destroys all traces of its past, how many chapters of our own origin story remain missing? The viewer is drawn into an atmospheric sequence. The moon's terminator line drifts slowly across the regolith, half illuminating vast plains of silence. The narrator underscores the mystery. We rely on instruments, telemetry, photographs, and recollections. These form a chain of evidence, robust yet not immune to scrutiny. Because evidence is not merely documentation, it is a bridge between observation and belief. And belief is where reinterpretation thrives. The narrative deepens as visual metaphors expand. The moonlight transitions into scenes of the Earth's deep mantle, then shifts back to lunar orbit. The oscillation reinforces the idea that human certainty is caught between two extremes, a world that forgets everything and a world that forgets nothing. Knowledge in this context becomes a balancing act across cosmic contrasts. Skepticism emerges not as rejection, but as acknowledgement of the boundaries of human perception. The impossibility lies not in the event, but in our desire for evidence untainted by interpretation, untouched by narrative, undisputed across time. The pacing slows. The camera moves inward through a visualization of neural networks, ancient cave markings, and fragments of fossil strata, symbols of how humans encode, protect, and lose meaning. The narrator reflects. For those who question the moon mission, the vacuum becomes a metaphor for epistemic solitude, a place where truth cannot rely on Earth's familiar mechanisms of verification, a realm where every piece of data must stand alone. And this solitude echoes the silence of epochs erased long before vertebrates existed. By drawing this parallel, the script reinforces its core mystery. The deeper we look into Earth's forgotten eras, the more comfortable we become with the notion that entire realities can evaporate without a trace. And once we accept that, our understanding of proof, whether geological or historical, changes forever. This chapter concludes with a bridging reflection. If ancient Earth teaches us that memory can vanish, and the moon teaches us that memory can persist indefinitely, then our certainty about any narrative becomes a negotiation between two extremes. It is in this negotiation that reinterpretative theories arise, not to deny, but to illuminate the spaces where certainty falters. A quiet crescendo lifts the viewer back into lunar orbit as the narrator's voice settles into a poised question. What happens when humanity seeks truth in places where the universe itself remains indifferent to our need for answers? Where does meaning reside when both memory and oblivion shape our understanding of the past?